Are your combat encounters as awesome as they could be? Let's talk about designing better fights starting right now. If this is your first visit and you want tips and tricks to make your role-playing games a little bit more awesome, start now by subscribing and hitting the bell so you can stay in the know. When I started out DMing way back in the dark ages of 2nd edition, I made a bunch of mistakes. I threw encounters at my players without any real goals. I generally added in any bads that I thought looked cool in the monster manual with very few other considerations, and I shied away from using terrain so that most of my fights may have well as been in a boxing ring. The result? I had a heck of a time running interesting encounters, and my players got bored. Why wouldn't they? Combat encounters are the bread and butter of most RPGs, so why is it that they are often flat, sloggy, or otherwise boring? If any of this sounds familiar, this video is for you. This is part 3 of our multi-part discussion of making prep a little bit more awesome. In the last episode, we discussed building encounters actor and or setting agnostic and putting them together for fun and awesome. Before that, we talked about how we might use more of our work by making it more abstract. Today, we're going to talk about designing better encounters, and I'll throw an example at the end for free. Few things in our hobby are as ubiquitous as beating up the bads and taking their lunch money. In fact, you could say that the majority of the hobby is predicated upon it. And neither the encounters themselves nor the prep for them has to suck. We are now treading into the realm of game design, which I love. But first, let's talk about goals. Are we there yet? The first and probably most important things to establish are goals. This is less about killing the goblin guarding the chest and more about knowing when the encounter is over, so that not every fight has to be to the death. This also helps you understand what the acceptable solutions might look like and which things won't work. You should also think about the other side too. What do the bads want? In the most basic terms, you want your encounter to end when the players run out of interesting decisions. Don't drag out a thing to the bitter end unless you absolutely have to. Doing so often leads to boredom, and we don't want that. If you've ever had a slog of a fight with a boss that had way too many hit points, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is usually better to end an encounter too soon rather than let it overstay its welcome. Here are some examples. Most animals will not fight to the death unless cornered. An animal defending its den may fight ferociously to protect its young, but it will rarely give chase. Rats and other vermin are notoriously skittish, which is going to make the 10 rat tails quest a real pain in the butt. Similarly, forest creatures will usually run when outmatched, and flying creatures, geez, they have almost no reason to stay in a losing fight. If you care about the verisimilitude of your encounters, give these things some thought. Next example. Gnoll henchbads are protecting a jar of ceremonial wine reserved for the Great Sootpaw. They will protect the jar as their sacred duty with their very lives if needed. But if the jar is broken by the players, they will flee from the fight. They are not compelled to stay once they've failed in their duty. What if the player characters instead try to parlay for the jar? I'll bet you these gnolls have a price. How much coin do the player characters have to put down? Reward your players' ingenuity. Remember, it shouldn't matter how they solve the thing, as long as they do. Next example. A small number of sentries watch a back entrance. Show a warhorn hanging nearby, just out of reach. When the player characters attack, have one of the sentries lunge toward the horn while the others fight defensively. They are not fighting to win, they're fighting to delay till their pals can show up. If the players destroy the horn, you better bet those sentries are running away to warn their pals in person. And if you don't want to entice your players into a losing fight, make sure there are way more bads than reasonable. Players hate backing down from a fight, but remember, killing the player characters is the least interesting thing we can do to them. You can't trust those mountains. Terrain and environment can and probably should be a part of most encounters. I draw a distinction between the terrain, the geometry of the map, and the environment, the setting and or flavor of the map. You can do a lot with both, and they overlap in many ways, but like most things, they are easy to mess up. Unless the terrain and environment are the centerpiece of the encounter, try not to make them outshine everything else. Terrain is like pepper. A little goes a long way, and it's really easy to add too much. Terrain is really good for constraining movement like putting up walls and cliffs, encouraging particular movement patterns like funnels and choke points, providing obvious attack vectors like having multiple corridors leading to the same cave, and providing cover and concealment to combatants. And this works for both sides of the engagement. That's right, the bads can use this stuff too. Environment could be thought of as window dressing for the terrain, but you can also use it dynamically. Hazards like lava can be key parts of the encounter. High winds can prevent precise movement. Teetering stones can be pushed on top of unwitting monsters for massive damage, and the shifting deck of a pirate ship in a storm is just plain full of awesome. Who doesn't want to have a fight on the pitching pirate ship? Given all of that, here's some stuff you should consider when building a battle map. Does your terrain constrain or limit the play area in a meaningful way? What are the elevation changes and sightlines? Does the terrain and environment give an advantage to one side or the other? Is there an obvious path or approach? Like everything else, building battle maps is a really deep topic, but that's a different video. Now where does this key go? Not all fights need to be mechanically complicated, but some definitely should be. A little bit of mechanical depth can go a long way. It can make a vanilla encounter a lot more interesting, but it can also make an encounter a lot more dangerous. Encounter mechanics can do one or more of these things. They can constrain available resources like slowing movement or having hit points. They can restrict available options like putting the bads across a river of lava or preventing spellcasting. They can add a measure of risk to the proceedings like rocks falling from the ceiling, or they can change a significant aspect of the fight like spawning new bads on a timer. We are a long way from the days of an orc in a featureless 10x10 room guarding a chest. When you're choosing your bads, try to pick actors that are plausible in your encounter. You can get a lot of mileage out of making your encounter setting agnostic, but the same is not always true in the other direction. Sometimes the environment constrains the available types of bads. For instance, lava monsters aren't often found amongst glacial peaks, and you don't have to limit yourself to the stuff in the monster manual either. Here are some of my mechanical go-tos. Traps laid by bads who know the player characters are on their way. Swarms of one-hit point minions who otherwise behave as normal mobs. It's like being in a John Woo film. Environmental traps like heat waves or wind gusts that happen on a randomly rolled timer, and multi-phase bosses that change behavior like you'd see in your favorite MMO. Note that there is a limit to how much complexity you can throw into a fight before it becomes a problem. My rule of thumb is that no encounter should have more than a handful of different types of bads or more than 3 moving parts. A timer is a moving part, so is a spellcaster with a large spell list, and so is a script. What's my line anyway? For bosses, complicated rooms, and other fun situations, I sometimes prefer scripts. A script serves 2 purposes. It makes it easier for you to track and run, and it makes it easier for your players to predict. This isn't an MMO. They aren't going to be able to practice this stuff. Most mechanics will take up to 2 cycles for players to grok, and try to make your script's length fit easily within typical combat. And you do know how long your combats usually take, right? Each piece of a script has a trigger and an action. The trigger is the thing that sets off the action, like a timer or the boss hitting half health. The action is the thing that happens, like a breath weapon or vents filling the area with fire. While you can have an almost limitless number of things in your script, you should keep them to a minimum. Basically, if you can't memorize it, you're very likely to forget key parts of it during the fight, so don't tempt fate. Here are a few trigger action examples. On a 1d4 round timer, the floor shakes terribly, requiring a saving throw to avoid falling down. On every 3rd round, spikes shoot through the marked tiles on the floor, potentially skewering player characters. On a timer, a new batch of minions swarms the party. When the boss reaches half health, he goes berserk, doubling his damage but reducing his defense. If all of this sounds like fun, it is, but we're just getting started. I brought salsa! Now we can get to the fun stuff. Let's design the boss encounter. Sootpaw is our uplifted gnoll from last episode's mini-arc who has control over fire. The bads know the player characters are on the way, so we can assume that the gnolls are prepared. As the last encounter, we want this one to be memorable and challenging, so let's pull out all the stops and get this thing cranked up to 11. For this encounter, we will have 3 types of bads. We have a pair of bodyguards armed with bows. We have a handful of beefy melee blockers, and we have Sootpaw himself. Since the gnolls are prepared, we want to imagine that they've laid traps. For static traps to be effective, we need to predict the group's movement. The best way to predict movement? Build the terrain to encourage it. Blam! We've got Sootpaw up here on the dais with his bodyguards. Being ranged dudes, they are not tempted to move, and they should prioritize casters first. Let's show off their canine cleverness. Our blockers are over here, hidden. We'll get to them in a bit. The terrain itself suggests move here very strongly, so that's where they've put their snare traps to slow the PC's progress. Note the ceremonial fires in this area. The encounter has a simple script with these pieces. If a projectile travels within 25 feet of one of the fires, block it with fire if possible once a round. On a 1d3 timer, Sootpaw will attack the nearest PC from the nearest fire. When the player characters have reached the traps, the blockers will pounce to prevent easy movement, and if any type of fire attack is used by the player characters, send it back toward the attacker. That'll piss them off. We expect the players to look at the initial encounter and think it's obvious. The first arrow fired will be blocked, heightening their suspicion. We can expect the melee-type PCs to charge unless they're unusually wary, and when the blockers pounce, we want them to feel like they're doomed. But they're players. They usually find a way. This is how I build my encounters for fun and awesome. What are your best tips for building encounters? We would love to read your ideas down in the comments below. This is part 3 of our multi-part discussion, where we delve into making prep a little bit more awesome. To catch the next installment, start by subscribing and hitting the bell so you can stay in the know. Thanks for staying classy, and I'll see you on Sunday.